The wind that howled down the canyon of Lexington Avenue was a physical entity, a predator with teeth of ice. It found every seam in Camila Santos's thin blue coat, every gap in the wool of her scarf, and sank its fangs deep into her bones. Snow, thick and wet, fell not in gentle flakes, but in aggressive wind-driven sheets, plastering itself to the grimy glass of the bus shelter. It was 2 o'clock in the morning in the heart of a New York City blizzard, a time when the city that never sleeps was forced into a comatose, white-shrouded silence. For Camila, it was just the end of another Tuesday. A 16-hour shift at Bronx Municipal Hospital had bled into a Wednesday, a brutal marathon of trauma, exhaustion, and the quiet, desperate victories that kept her going. She had spent the last 4 hours in the pediatric burn unit, a special kind of hell where the air tasted of antiseptic and sorrow. She had meticulously debrided the charred skin from a toddler's arm, her own scarred hands moving with a practiced, gentle precision. She had held the hand of a terrified teenager who had fallen into a bonfire, whispering words of encouragement while the doctors worked. She had calmed a hysterical mother, updated a worried father, and in a quiet moment had sat with a child who wouldn't make it through the night, her presence a silent, final act of compassion. Now, she was stranded. Her phone, the lifeline to her world, was a dead black rectangle in her freezing hand. The bus, according to the schedule posted behind the graffiti-scarred plexiglass, should have come an hour ago. But in this weather, schedules were a fiction, a cruel joke played on the city's working poor who couldn't afford a taxi, let alone a car. She huddled deeper into her coat, the fabric offering as much protection as a paper bag. Her lips were numb, a dull, purplish color she recognized as the first stage of frostbite. She couldn't feel her fingers or her toes. The cold was no longer just on her skin. It was seeping into her marrow, a slow, insidious invasion. A pair of headlights cut through the swirling snow, their beams bright and piercing. They belonged to a vehicle that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. A silent, black predator gliding through the deserted, snow-choked streets. It was a Bentley, a machine so alien to this part of the city, at this time of night, that it might as well have been a spaceship. It pulled to a silent stop directly in front of her bus shelter. The passenger side window whispered down, "You're coming with me." The voice was not a suggestion. It was a command. It was deep, resonant, and carried an unnerving, non-negotiable authority. Camila looked up, shielding her eyes from the sudden light, her own breath a thick white cloud in front of her face. A man, tall and impeccably dressed, was getting out of the driver's side. Even in the dim, snow-filtered light, she could see the severe, elegant lines of his overcoat, a garment that likely cost more than her monthly rent. Her instincts, honed by a decade of navigating the world as a black woman in a system not built for her, screamed at her. Alarm bells, loud and frantic, went off in her head. She instinctively took a step back, her body tensing. "I'm sorry, but I don't," she began, her voice hoarse and weak. "It's not a request," the man interrupted, his tone sharp, impatient. He was already shrugging off his heavy wool coat. He held it out to her, a silent, commanding offering. "You'll freeze to death if you stay here another 10 minutes. He was right, and she knew it. The shivering had started to subside, a dangerous sign that her body was beginning to shut down. He was perhaps 40, with sharp, intelligent features, steel-gray eyes that seemed to analyze everything they saw, and an air of absolute, unshakable confidence. This was a man accustomed to being obeyed. This was a man who moved through the world as if he owned it. This was Alexander Whitmore. At 42, he had never stopped for a stranger on the street in his life. His world was one of private jets, climate-controlled boardrooms, and a carefully curated existence that insulated him from the messy, unpredictable realities of a life like Camila's. As the CEO of Whitmore Medical Group, the largest and most aggressive private hospital network in the country, his $3 billion fortune had been built on a ruthless altar of efficiency, cold calculation, and the kind of quick, decisions that crushed lives and unions with equal, dispassionate force. But something, as he was being driven home from a late-night meeting, had made him tell his driver to stop. He had seen the lone figure huddled in the bus shelter, a small, stubborn point of life in a sea of white oblivion. He had seen the exhaustion in her posture, the messy bun of curly hair escaping from her beanie, the blue coat that was no match for the storm, and something buried deep within the permafrost of his conscience, some long-dormant impulse, had stirred. Camila hesitated. A decade as a nurse, a lifetime as a black woman, had taught her to be wary. Help from rich, powerful white men was never free. It always came with a price. a hidden ledger of expectations and obligations, but the cold was a more immediate, more tangible threat. She could feel the dangerous lethargy seeping into her limbs. With a final reluctant nod, she accepted the coat. It was incredibly heavy, lined with cashmere, and smelled faintly of expensive cologne and success. "Where do you live?" Alexander asked, his hand already on the passenger door, holding it open for her. The gesture was polite, but his stance was impatient. "Harlem," she murmured, the word a puff of white vapor. She finally slid into the car, the sudden warmth a shock to her system. The interior of the Bentley was another world. The scent of supple, hand-stitched Italian leather and polished burled walnut filled the air. The silence was absolute, a heavy, expensive silence that was the ultimate luxury in a city of noise. It was the kind of quiet that cost more than Camila's entire apartment. She sank into the plush seat, the warmth slowly, painfully, beginning to penetrate her frozen limbs. She watched Alexander get back into the driver's seat. His movements were precise, economical, devoid of any wasted motion. He adjusted the climate controls, his perfectly manicured fingers moving with practiced ease. Nothing about this man was casual. Everything was intentional. "Do you work at Metropolitan?" he asked, his voice smooth, conversational. The question seemed too random to be natural. "Bronx Municipal," she replied, her voice still hoarse. She watched his eyes, trying to read them in the dim light of the dashboard. They seemed to light up with a flicker of interest. "I'm a nurse, pediatric emergency," she added, for reasons she didn't quite understand. "Burn unit." "That must be challenging," Alexander commented. But his tone was off. It wasn't the sound of genuine empathy. It was the sound of a manager evaluating a potential asset, a CEO assessing a resource. "How many years of experience do you have?" Camila frowned. It was the third specific, professional question he had asked in under 5 minutes. This was not idle chit-chat. This was an interrogation disguised as a conversation. 10 years, she answered, her own voice becoming more guarded. "Why all the curiosity?" "Professional admiration," he said, flashing a smile that was perfectly executed but reached nowhere near his cold, gray eyes. "I always respect dedication and expertise in any field." During the drive, a silent, surreal journey through the deserted, snow-blanketed city, she watched him. She noted the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, a timepiece that cost more than her car. She noted the perfect, severe cut of his suit. She noted the way his hands, strong and sure, rested on the steering wheel, and he kept asking questions. Questions about hospital protocols, about shift lengths, about staffing ratios, about her colleagues. They were questions that were far too specific, far too technical, for casual curiosity. "I've been with the public system for 10 years, she said, deciding to test a growing, deeply unsettling suspicion. "Even with all the recent changes." "Changes?" Alexander asked, his tone carefully neutral, but she saw it, a flicker of something in his eyes. He wasn't surprised. He knew exactly what she was talking about. "The acquisitions," she said, her voice slow and deliberate, watching his face for a reaction. "A private network bought 3 public hospitals in the city recently, Whitmore Medical Group." She pronounced the name with a careful, pointed emphasis. A single muscle twitched in his jaw. It was a minuscule, almost imperceptible tell, but she saw it. "I know the company well," he said, his voice a smooth, polished stone. When they arrived at her building, a pre-war walk-up with a crumbling facade and a flickering light in the entryway, the contrast with the world of the Bentley was jarring. Alexander insisted on walking her to the door. The elevator, as usual, was broken. As they climbed the 5 flights of stairs, the air grew thick with the smells of her world. Old paint, damp plaster, the lingering aroma of 100 different dinners. Alexander remained silent, but his eyes were constantly moving, cataloging every detail. The peeling paint on the walls, the dimly lit, narrow hallways, the stark, brutal difference between this world and his own. At her apartment door, she turned to face him. "Camila Santos," she said, realizing with a jolt that he had asked her for her full name twice during the drive. "Alexander Whitmore," he replied, handing her a business card. It was thick, heavy cardstock, the lettering embossed in gold. "If you need anything," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, "anything at all, call me." She took the card. Her heart, which had been slowly returning to a normal rhythm, began to pound again. She looked down at the gold lettering. Alexander Whitmore, CEO Whitmore Medical Group, the man who had just bought her hospital. The man who, according to the city news, was planning a significant restructuring of the medical staff. A corporate euphemism she knew all too well meant mass layoffs. "Thanks for the ride," she said, her voice a strained whisper. She forced a smile as 1,000 frantic thoughts raced through her mind. Was this a coincidence, a one-in-a-billion chance encounter in a blizzard? Or was it something else entirely? The moment the door was closed and bolted behind her, Alexander Whitmore, standing alone in the dingy, poorly lit hallway, allowed a strange, predatory smile to form on his lips. He took out his cell phone and dialed a number from his private contacts. "David, it's me," he said, his voice low and cold. "I need a complete background check. A nurse, her name is Camila Santos, Bronx Municipal Hospital. I want everything. Performance evaluations, disciplinary history, social media footprint, financial records, everything. And David," he paused, "I need it by morning." On the other side of the door, Camila leaned against the solid wood, her own heart hammering against her ribs. The adrenaline that had gotten her through her shift was back, but this time it was laced with a cold, terrifying dread. There was something in his eyes that didn't match his act of kindness, a calculated coldness, a detached, analytical gaze that she recognized all too well. It was the look of a powerful man who saw people not as human beings, but as assets or liabilities, as problems to be managed or eliminated. She stumbled to her small desk, her frozen fingers fumbling with her laptop. She typed Alexander Whitmore into the search bar. The headlines that appeared made her blood run cold. CEO fires 600 employees via email in restructuring. Whitmore closes pediatric ward at public hospital to cut costs. Toxic work environment. Employees denounce Whitmore Medical's corporate culture, but it was the last link, a link to a leaked audio recording from an internal meeting, that made her hand shake so violently she could barely control the mouse. The headline read, "Leaked recording, Whitmore CEO calls black employees a human resource." Problem to be solved. The chance encounter in the snowstorm suddenly didn't seem so random anymore. Camila looked at the heavy gold-embossed business card. In her hand, it felt less like an offer of help and more like a declaration of war. She had a sinking, terrifying feeling that she had just appeared on the radar of a man who could, with a single phone call, destroy her entire career, and she had no idea why. 3 days later, the first shot was fired. Camila was in the middle of a delicate emergency procedure on a 6-year-old girl with third-degree burns when her supervisor, Margaret, appeared at the door of the operating room. Margaret was a good manager, a veteran nurse who had seen it all, but her face was pale, her expression grim. "Santos, I need to talk to you now." Margaret's icy tone, a tone Camila had never heard her use before, sent a ripple of tension through the surgical team. Camila finished placing the last suture with her customary steady hand, gave quiet instructions to the junior nurse, and then, her heart already beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread, she followed her supervisor to the administrative office. The papers were already on the table. "We've received some concerns about your performance," Margaret began, avoiding eye contact. Her gaze fixed on a point on the wall just over Camila's shoulder. "Reports of recklessness. Questions about your adherence to protocols." Camila stared at her, dumbfounded. "What reports? My performance has always been exemplary. You told me yourself last week that I was the best nurse on the pediatric team." "Things have changed, Camila," Margaret said, her voice low. She slid a thick folder across the desk. 3 anonymous reports arrived this morning, all filed within the same hour. They contained some very serious allegations of medical negligence. Camila's hands trembled as she opened the folder. The accusations were a dizzying blend of truth and fiction, a masterful work of malicious invention. Someone had taken her most recent, most complex cases and twisted them, reframing her expert, life-saving improvisations as reckless deviations from standard procedure. They had turned her strengths into weaknesses, her skill into evidence of incompetence. It was surgically precise, and utterly devastating. "This is ridiculous," Camila breathed, the words catching in her throat. "Margaret, you've known me for 10 years, you've seen my work. When have I ever been negligent?" Margaret finally met her eyes, and what Camila saw there was a mixture of pity and fear. "Management is concerned," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "especially with the changes in leadership." She sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "The new Whitmore administration. They don't tolerate any level of risk. They've implemented new evaluation protocols. They're much more rigorous." The name hit Camila like a physical blow. "Whitmore, this is because of him," she said, her voice flat. "He's behind this." "I don't know what you're talking about," Margaret said, but her eyes darted away again. "All I know is that you're going to have to prove these accusations are false. And until you do, Camila, I'm so sorry. You're suspended from all surgical duties." effective immediately. Camila left the meeting in a daze, the world seeming to tilt and warp around her. 10 years of an impeccable career, a decade of dedication and sacrifice, was being systematically dismantled by anonymous reports that had appeared, as if by black magic, just days after her encounter with Alexander Whitmore. The coincidence was not just impossible to ignore, it was a screaming siren. On the bus ride home, a ride she now had to take in the middle of the day, she saw it. A black sedan, nondescript but sleek, was behind the bus. It stayed with her, 2 car lengths back, for 10 blocks. To test her growing paranoia, she got off the bus 3 stops early. She ducked into a bodega, her heart pounding. Through the front window, she saw the sedan slow down, then continue on. But as she walked the rest of the way home, she caught a glimpse of it in the reflection of a storefront window, parked 2 blocks back, waiting. She was being followed. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, a text from an unknown number. "I heard about your problems at work. A real shame for someone with your talent. If you need to talk, I'm available." Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. How could he possibly know about her suspension already? She hadn't told a soul. He was playing with her, a cat with a cornered mouse, enjoying her fear, her confusion. That night she called her sister. Camila Santos was a force of nature, a brilliant, sharp-tongued labor lawyer in Chicago who had fought and won against some of the biggest corporations in the country. "Lena, I need your help," Camila said, her voice cracking. "Someone is trying to destroy my career." "Calm down, Cammy." Helena's voice was a steady, reassuring presence over the line. "Take a breath. Tell me everything, from the beginning." As Camila recounted the events of the past few days, the chance encounter in the blizzard, the strangely specific questions, the anonymous reports, the black sedan, the taunting text messenger, chilling pattern began to emerge. Alexander hadn't just found her by chance, he had been hunting. "Wait," Helena interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp with alarm. "Did you say Whitmore Medical, Camila? That company is infamous. They have a reputation for aggressive, hostile acquisition practices. They have a playbook. When they take over a public institution, they identify key employees," Helena explained, her lawyer's mind already dissecting the situation. "Union leaders, senior staff with deep institutional knowledge, anyone who might resist their changes, and they either co-opt them or they eliminate them." "Eliminate them how?" "Fabricated disciplinary proceedings, forced transfers to undesirable positions, creating a toxic work environment until the person quits. Anything to neutralize a perceived threat before the merger is complete." "But why you, Cammy? Why would they focus on you specifically?" Camila thought back to the questions Alexander had asked in the car. The questions about protocols, about her experience, about her specialization in the pediatric burn unit, a department that was notoriously expensive to run. "Because I know how the hospital really works," she said, the realization dawning on her with a cold, sickening clarity. "I know where the bodies are buried. I know every flaw in the system, every corner they'll try to cut to reduce costs and maximize their profits. I'm not just a nurse, Lena. I'm a witness." "Or," Helena said, her voice grim, "you represent a specific threat he has identified. You need to be careful, Cammy. These people don't play fair." In the weeks that followed, the psychological warfare intensified. Alexander became a ghost in her life, a constant, unnerving presence. He would be at the coffee shop where she had lunch, claiming a business meeting had been cancelled nearby. He would be at the grocery store near her apartment, feigning surprise. "Oh, Camila, I've just taken up a daytara in the neighborhood. We must be neighbors." He showed up at the hospital during her now desk-bound shifts, on the pretext of visiting the new facilities. Each encounter was perfectly calibrated. He was always cordial, always concerned. He would ask about her suspension, offer his help, show a deep, sincere interest in her problems. But his eyes, those cold, gray, analytical eyes, always told a different story, and he always knew things he shouldn't know. "I heard your initial appeal was denied," he said during one chance meeting at a pharmacy. "That must be very frustrating for someone with your level of experience." "How did you know that?" she asked, her voice sharp. The appeal denial had only been communicated to her an hour ago. News travels fast in the medical world. He smiled, that same empty, polished smile. "Perhaps I can help. I know some people in senior management. A word from me could go a long way." "Thank you, Alexander, but I'll handle it on my own," she said, her own voice now as cold as his. "Of course," he replied, his smile widening slightly. "You've always been independent." The way he said it, the casual intimacy of it, sent a shiver down her spine. It sounded as if he had been studying her for years, not days. He was not just trying to get her fired. He was trying to get inside her head. He was trying to break her that night. Camila Santos, the woman who had always been fiercely independent, the woman who had always handled her own battles, did something she had never done before. She used her emergency savings, the money she had painstakingly put aside for a down payment on a small house, and she hired a private investigator. She needed to know who she was fighting. She needed to know everything about the ghost and the Bentley. The first report from the investigator, a gruff, cynical ex-NYPD detective named Tony Reeves, arrived a week later. It confirmed her worst fears. Alexander Whitmore had a well-documented history. At every hospital his company had acquired a handful of key, senior employees, particularly women of color, had been systematically targeted and forced out through mysterious, anonymous, disciplinary investigations that always resulted in their dismissal. But it was the second report that truly terrified her. Tony had uncovered a disturbing pattern of personal interest. 3 other cases, over the past 5 years, of brilliant, promising black women in medical leadership positions who had suddenly, inexplicably, lost their careers after brief, intense interactions with Alexander Whitmore himself. Camila finally understood. This wasn't just corporate strategy. This wasn't just paranoia. This was a hunt. Alexander Whitmore was a predator, and she was his chosen prey. She had walked, shivering and grateful, right into his perfectly set trap. And now, she had to figure out how to escape. The second report from Tony Reeves was not delivered in a manila envelope. It was delivered on a heavily encrypted hard drive. And Tony insisted they meet in a place with no cameras and no cell service, the echoing, cavernous, main reading room of the New York Public Library. Amidst the ghosts of a million silent stories, he revealed a truth far more sinister than corporate malfeasance. "Camila, you need to see this," Tony said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that was still a violation of the room's sacred silence. He opened a laptop and turned the screen towards her. "Alexander Whitmore isn't just a ruthless CEO, he's a calculating psychopath, and you are his latest project." The evidence was a chilling descent into a mind warped by power and prejudice. Tony had gained access, through a source deep inside Whitmore Medical's IT department, to Alexander's private, encrypted files. There were transcripts of text messages and emails that went back years. Alexander didn't just fire people, he deconstructed them. He referred to his targets as deconstruction projects. It was a game to him, a sick, twisted hobby. One message, sent to a fellow executive, made Camila's stomach churn. "The black nurse is taking the bait perfectly. A few more weeks of applied pressure and she'll be completely destroyed professionally. I'll bet you 50 grand she'll beg me for a reference by the time I'm done with her." The reply was a single laughing emoji. "How did you get this?" Camila asked, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with a cold rising fury. "I have my contacts," Tony said grimly. More importantly, one of his previous projects, Dr. Patricia Williams, is now willing to testify. He destroyed her. She was the head of cardiology at a hospital in Philadelphia. He ruined her career, leaked false rumors that led to a bitter custody battle, and left her financially and emotionally broken. She's been silent for 3 years, terrified of him, but when my source reached out and told her about you, something inside her snapped. He detailed the fates of the other 2 victims. One had moved to Canada, leaving medicine entirely, now working as a barista. The other had attempted suicide, twice. "Camila," Tony said, his ex-cop eyes hard and serious, "this man destroys lives for sport, and you have been specifically targeted. It's a pattern. He fixates on competent, respected black women in positions of authority. It's some kind of sick, racist, misogynistic fetishization of domination for him." As if on cue, Alexander intensified his psychological games. The chance encounters became more frequent, more brazen. He showed up at the hospital during her desk duty shift with an ostentatious bouquet of lilies, playing the role of the concerned, romantic suitor for the benefit of her colleagues. "I thought you might need something to brighten your day," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire nurses' station to hear. "I heard you've been facing some challenges at work lately." Camila accepted the flowers, her face a mask of polite gratitude, but her eyes were pure ice. "How very kind of you, Alexander. You shouldn't have." "Of course, I should," he smiled, and for a moment he let his own mask slip, a flicker of cruel amusement in his eyes. "After all, I am partly responsible for the administrative changes around here. It would be a terrible shame if such a qualified, experienced nurse were to lose her job because of a few simple misunderstandings. The threat was unmistakable, a velvet glove wrapped around a mailed fist. It was a public marking of his territory, a demonstration to her colleagues that he held her professional fate in the palm of his hand. That night, on a secure video call, Camila, Helena and Tony planned their counteroffensive. Helena, her lawyer's mind worry, was adamant. A simple lawsuit isn't enough, she argued. He'll bury us in motions. He'll use his army of lawyers to drag it out for years, bankrupting you in the process. We can't fight him on his turf. We have to create a new one. The plan they devised was audacious, a high-stakes gambit that would require nerves of steel. They would not just defend Camila, they would dismantle Alexander's entire empire of lies. Camila, with Tony's guidance, would continue to play the part of the frightened, overwhelmed victim. She would let Alexander think his campaign of terror was working, but all the while, she would be gathering intelligence, a one-woman espionage unit operating behind enemy lines. She began to record every conversation, using a sophisticated app on her phone that automatically uploaded encrypted audio files to a secure server controlled by Helena. Every veiled threat, every condescending comment, every display of his suffocating arrogance was being meticulously documented. She engaged him, feigning despair, asking for his advice, subtly leading him to incriminate himself further. Turning point came when Alexander, drunk on his own power and convinced of her impending collapse, made his biggest mistake. After a particularly harrowing day where a second, even more ludicrous set of anonymous complaints were filed against her, he sent her a text message. It was so explicitly threatening, so grotesquely arrogant, that it was the legal equivalent of a signed confession. Camila, I hope you understand that your position at this hospital, and indeed your entire career, depends entirely on my goodwill. It would be a terrible shame if other irregularities were to appear in your file. Some people, through no fault of their own, are simply not cut out for positions of responsibility. I'm sure a smart woman like you knows exactly what I mean. Let's have dinner, we can discuss your future. When Camila forwarded the message to Helena, her sister's response was a single, triumphant line of text. He just hung himself. The rope is in your hand. The final piece of the puzzle came from Tony. His source inside Whitmore, it had located it, Alexander's digital trophy case. It was a hidden, password-protected file on his private server, labeled simply Projects. It contained everything: photos, videos, and detailed psychological evaluations of the women he had destroyed. It was a predator's diary, complete with notes on which manipulation tactics had been most effective against each victim. Camila, Tony said, his voice grave over the phone, I got access. What I found, it's not just corporate harassment. This is evidence of a systematic pattern of racial and sexual persecution that could trigger a RICO investigation. This is federal criminal territory. While Alexander Whitmore continued his twisted cat-and-mouse game, convinced he was closing in on the kill, his prey was quietly, methodically, building the case that would not only destroy his career, but could very well put him behind bars. He had underestimated her. He thought she was just a nurse. He had no idea she was a warrior. The Whitmore Medical Group's quarterly board meeting was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m. on a sunny Tuesday morning in March. Alexander Whitmore entered the 50th floor conference room, a king surveying his domain. He greeted the 12 board members, a collection of gray-haired, powerful men and one woman with firm handshakes and calculated smiles. Gentlemen, Margaret, he began, turning on the large presentation screen. I have excellent news regarding the integration of the public hospitals. Operating efficiency is up 20%, and Alexander, the voice, cold as a tombstone, came from the head of the table. It was James Whitmore Sr., the company's founder, chairman of the board, and Alexander's uncle. Before we proceed, we have some urgent matters to discuss. The icy tone stopped Alexander cold. He looked around the table. The expressions he saw were not of admiration, but of grim, stony concern. Board members were avoiding his gaze, studying their notes with an unnatural intensity. Issues, James? He asked, trying to keep the confident swagger in his voice. Issues regarding your personal and professional conduct, said Margaret Chen, the Director of Human Resources. She slid a thick, bound folder across the polished mahogany table. We have received extensive and disturbing documentation regarding your extracurricular activities. Alexander opened the folder. His world tilted and spun. On the first page was a surveillance photo of him entering his private office at an unusual hour. On the second, printouts of his text messages to Camila. On the third, full transcripts of his recorded conversations, where he referred to his victims as deconstruction projects and bragged about his bet. Where did you get this? He stammered, his hands suddenly slick with sweat. From multiple corroborating sources, James Sr. replied, his voice heavy with disgust, including 3 of the country's top labor law firms, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He paused, letting the words land with the force of a physical blow, and an extraordinarily well-prepared and courageous young nurse from the Bronx. The conference room door swung open. Camila entered, flanked by Helena and Tony Reeves. Behind them stood 2 impassive, suit-clad figures. Alexander felt his legs give way beneath him. "Good morning, Alexander," Camila said. Her voice was calm, clear, and resonated with an authority he had never heard before. "I imagine you remember me. The nurse you tried to destroy for sport." "This is a misunderstanding," Alexander babbled, looking desperately from face to face around the table. "Gentlemen, you know me. These are lies. The accusations are meticulously documented." Helena interrupted, placing a second, even thicker folder on the table. "The testimony of 3 previous victims, 15 months of surveillance, verifiable evidence of systematic discrimination based on race and gender, explicit criminal threats, and this." She tapped a tablet on the table, and the audio from the trophy room conversation filled the silent room. Alexander's voice, bragging, laughing, describing Camila as part of his sick game. Margaret Chen closed her eyes, her face a mask of shame and fury. "Alexander, this is not just corporate malfeasance. This is criminally prosecutable, on a federal level." Agent Morrison, one of the men in suits, said, stepping forward and flashing his badge. "FBI Alexander Whitmore, you are under arrest for multiple violations of Federal Civil Rights Code 18, Section 242, conspiracy to commit systematic, racial and sexual discrimination, and criminal harassment." Alexander lunged to his feet, knocking over his chair. "You can't do this. I am the CEO of this company. I built this." "Actually," James Sr. said, rising slowly to his full, imposing height, "you're not. As of 5 minutes ago, the board voted unanimously for your immediate and permanent removal. Your contracts are null and void. Your shares have been placed in escrow, and you are permanently barred from holding any executive position at this company, or any of its subsidiaries, for life." Tony Reeves opened his laptop and turned it for Alexander to see. On the screen were the live feeds of 3 major news channels. The headlines were brutal. Whitmore Medical CEO arrested in shocking racial discrimination probe. Billionaire executive kept trophies of black female victims. Leaked recordings revealed deconstruction projects at hospital network. Alexander stared at Camila, his eyes now wild with a desperate, pleading terror. "You don't understand what you've done," he whispered. "You've destroyed everything." "No," Camila said, her voice soft but unyielding. She walked towards him, stopping just out of his reach. "You did this. I didn't destroy careers. I saved them. I saved lives. And most importantly, I saved other women from ever having to cross your path." She held up her own phone, showing him the flood of messages that were already pouring in on social media from other nurses, other doctors, other black women in medicine, telling their own stories, finally feeling empowered to speak out. "You didn't just target me, Alexander. You exposed a disease. And now, the treatment begins." As the FBI agent cuffed his hands behind his back, Alexander made one last, pathetic gambit. "Camila, please, I can make this right. Money, a promotion, anything you want." She just shook her head, a sad, weary smile on her lips. "The only thing you can give me now, Alexander," she said, "is the satisfaction of knowing you will never, ever do this to anyone again." As he was escorted out of the room, a broken man walking towards the glare of the cameras and the ruin of his life, James Sr. approached Camila. "Miss Santos," he said, his voice filled with a deep, weary respect, "the board would like to offer you the position of Director of Hospital Quality and Integrity for the entire Whitmore network. Your starting salary will be $250,000 a year, plus full benefits and a mandate to clean this company from the inside out." Camila looked out the vast conference room window. She watched as Alexander was bundled into the back of an unmarked police car. She saw the faces of other nurses in the crowd of reporters, their faces filled with a mixture of shock and triumphant hope. "I accept," she said, her voice firm, "on one condition. I want ironclad, legally binding protective protocols for all employees who report discrimination, and I want to establish a multi-million-dollar scholarship fund, specifically for black nurses to pursue advanced degrees and leadership positions. Dunn, James Sr., replied without a moment's hesitation. That cold night at the bus stop had not been the beginning of her destruction. It had been the catalyst for a revolution. A revolution she had led, not with anger, but with the quiet, devastating precision of a healer who knew exactly how to excise a cancer.